And you're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2, 48 hours of nonfiction books every weekend, also available on the web at booktv.org. Well, this book is being released today. It's called The Rogue, Searching for the Real Sarah Palin, and author Joe McGinniss now joins us to talk about his newly released book from New York. Mr. McGinniss, how is it that you ended up living next to Sarah Palin when you were researching your book?
I got very, very lucky, Peter. I was in Alaska in May of 2010 and actually looking for a place to live because I knew I was going to be out there for a few months. And I wanted to live in Wasilla because at that point in my research, about 80% of the people that I still needed to talk to were in or near Wasilla. But I couldn't find anything up there, so an hour and 20 minutes away in Anchorage, much bigger city, I found an apartment and a little mother-in-law apartment rented by a school teacher, and I was going to go over there at 6 o'clock that night to sign a 4-month lease for that apartment. And at 3 o'clock that afternoon, my cell phone rang, and it was a woman named Catherine Taylor calling. And she said, "I've been trying to reach you for months because I heard you're coming back this summer, and I heard you're looking for a place to live, and I have a house in Wasilla that would be available for you to rent." And I said, "Well, where in Wasilla is this located?" And she said, "Well, it's right next door to Todd and Sarah Palin." So I said, well, this is my lucky day. And I drove up there the next day, took a look at the house, and moved in the following weekend.
And what was the reaction of the Palins?
Well, they weren't happy. They weren't happy at all. I didn't think they'd be happy because they knew I was writing a book about Sarah, and I had already published an article in Portfolio magazine about her failed attempt to build an Alaska gas pipeline, and that piece annoyed her considerably. But I expected they would at least be mature about it. The third day I was there, I was out on my porch in the early evening, and Todd came walking around the fence, at the end of the fence that separates the two properties, and he walked up to me and said, "Well, what are you doing here? You know, who are you and what are you doing here?" Oddly enough, Todd and Sarah had rented the very same house. They had been renting this house through the previous fall, and then they decided they didn't want to pay the $3,000 a month anymore, so they canceled their rental and left Mrs. Taylor looking for a new tenant, and the new tenant she found was me. I explained this to Todd, and he said, "Well, I don't like this because you're writing a book about my wife, and now I'm worried about our privacy. Are you going to be, having long lens cameras, looking over the fence, taking pictures and sticking microphones there to hear what we're saying?" And I said, "No." I said, "Listen, Todd, I'm not the National Enquirer. In fact, as long as I'm here, your privacy is guaranteed because I'll do nothing to violate it and actually consider me sort of a buffer zone. So nobody else can approach your property either because I got to get through mine first." But he wasn't convinced by that. He felt that this was just my very presence there was something that was an affront. And a couple of hours later, I was actually standing on my porch at the end of it that faces away from the Palin's property, looking at a vacant wooded lot on the opposite side, talking on the cell phone to my wife back in Massachusetts. And they sent Track, their son who was just out of the Army, out into the backyard to surreptitiously take a cell phone picture of me. And that night, Sarah posted that picture on her Facebook page, and she said, "We have a new neighbor, Joe McGinniss, and here he is peering over the fence at our property. He could see into my 9-year-old daughter's bedroom, and who knows what he's up to. We feel that we're being stalked now." I forget her exact words, but it was a hysterical outburst. And the very next day, she called Glenn Beck and got on his radio show and was saying, this is terrible, I fear for the safety of my children, all kinds of crazy, hysterical overreaction to the simple fact of my moving in there next door. If she and Todd had handled it differently, nobody would even have known that I was living next door, because it wasn't something that I had any reason to want to publicize. That was just my location. We didn't have to be friends, but we could have at least gotten along in a civilized manner, and that's what I have been hoping for.
Mr. McGinniss, was that your only face-to-face meeting with the Palin family?
That was the only time I talked to any member of the family, that's right.
And right after that, a new fence went up, correct? And you have a picture of it in your new book, The Rogue.
Yes, there was a 10-foot high fence. The Palins built on the property next to Mrs. Taylor's house, and they built right up next to the property line, and they put up this 10-foot fence right in Mrs. Taylor's face. It was actually kind of an aggressive gesture on their part, but that fence had always been there. The next day, Todd brought in a crew of carpenters, and they added the height of the fence to make it 16 feet high. So there was actually a 10-foot fence, and then nailed up right on top of it was a 16-foot high fence. So that's the fence, actually, that when Sarah did that reality TV show on Discovery Channel last year, in the very first episode, she started off by talking about me living next door. And there was actually surreptitious footage taken of me sitting on my deck reading a book, minding my own business. And Sarah said, that's that new neighbor. Is he looking at us, Todd? Oh my gosh, I can't even sit out here and work on my papers because he might be looking at me. And she said, you know what, Todd, I want you to drill a hole in that fence so I can spy on him and see what he's up to. I mean, that was the approach that they took. They were very, very aggressive about it. And Todd actually said to me that first night, he said, how long are you going to be here? And I said, I think probably 3-4 months. And he said, yeah, well, we'll just see how long you stay here. And those were the last words I heard from any member of the Palin family.
Joe McGinniss, did you ever fear for your safety in your months in Alaska?
Well, I did, actually, Peter. I did, because the Palins have an ability to incite strong emotions in people. And a lot of the people they incite the emotions in own guns, to put it bluntly. And I had the mayor of Wasilla offer me a gun for my own protection. And I declined the offer, but he did put police patrols on to watch my house, keep it under surveillance, and also the Alaska State Police were parked just down the road checking on anybody who was approaching my house. But a couple of days after this, a right-wing radio talk show host named Mark Levin broadcast my email address on his show and urged his listeners to write to me and express their opinion of what kind of person I was for daring to move next door to Sarah Palin. And I began to get some of the ugliest, most hate-filled threats of violence I'd ever seen transmitted to anyone. Not only I was threatened, but my wife was threatened back in Massachusetts. Someone said, we should go visit Nancy because she must be lonely with Joe away. Let's just stop by and pay a little call on her. And I had someone else write and say, you're planning to bring your grandchildren out to visit you this summer? Well, they better just buy a one-way ticket, because if they come out, they're not going back. You'll find their bodies floating in Lake Lucille.
Joe McGinniss, describe Wasilla as you saw it.
Wasilla is a town that's come out of nowhere almost overnight. I was in Alaska in the mid to late 1970s to work on my book, Going to Extremes. And I can remember driving from Anchorage to Fairbanks, which is about an 8-hour trip. And just over an hour up the road, there was a blinking light, yellow blinking and red on either side, telling you to slow down. And there was a gas station, and there was a general store, and a post office, and that was Wasilla. They must have had about